Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming along. This is a bit of a snapshot of research, both old and new, that I've been doing, and hopefully give you a flavour of the kind of questions I'm grappling with. And there's many other evidential questions which I'd like to grapple with, but here's a snapshot of some things that I find particularly interesting. And I'm going to start with a real crime case. So we're going to start, it's quite a well-known case. I mean, maybe mainly in the UK, but there was in the UK a very well-known news broadcaster, Jill Dando, who was shot dead outside her flat in Fulham. This is in 1999. And so she was shot with a single shot to the back of the head at close range, and a man was seen running away from a crime scene. And so there was obviously a huge news. This was massive news, and people speculated about, the murder, whether it was maybe she was killed by a hitman. There were various different kind of theories developed, especially in the media. But after a year, there was very little progress in the investigation. So after about a year, police started following up on the massive number of phone calls they'd had, and they identified this individual, Barry George, who was who lived nearby Jill Dando. He was a loner with learning difficulties, and he also had a prior conviction for sexual assault. And there was, so in the kind of legal terminology, there was opportunity in the sense that several witnesses had claimed to have seen him near the flat earlier on in the day before the crime took place. And also he struggled to account for his whereabouts at the time of the shooting. There was also motive, or well, what seemed like motive. He was obsessed with female celebrities, and he was also obsessed with guns as well. There were also inconsistencies. When the police did interview him, there were various inconsistencies in his interview, including the fact that he claimed that he had no knowledge of who Jill Dando was, and he also knew nothing about guns. He wasn't interested in guns, which was then found to be disconfirmed, if you like, by pictures found on one of his cameras, which showed him clearly holding guns. And it turned out that he did have a history of interest in guns and celebrities. And he also had tried to fabricate an alibi. He'd gone back to where he was the afternoon of the crime, and he tried to kind of establish a time period that kind of would give him an alibi. So these are all kind of like, circumstantial evidence in a sense. And the police also searched his flat, and his flat he was a hoarder. It was a massive mess. Sorry, this is the only photo I could find of it. And there were thousands of newspapers and magazines, pictures of celebrities, gun magazines, etc., etc. And just one thing to note, they did actually find loads of pictures of Jill Dando, but they also had loads of pictures of all kinds of celebrities. So it wasn't like Jill Dando was singled out. There was just masses of newspapers and lots of pictures of celebrities. But one wasn't that strong against him, but then in the search of his flat, they found an overcoat, and in that overcoat, there was a particle of gunshot residue in the pocket. And this was matched to elements that were found at the crime scene in the shooting. Okay, so this was like the key connection that connected him to the crime. And this, I think then he was then charged and taken to court. And in the court, the gunshot residue played quite a large role in the gunshot residue evidence, played quite a large role, linked him to the crime. And the defense argued, or tried to argue, that the gunshot residue could have arisen from other means like contamination, etc., etc. And but the prosecution argued that actually this was the chance of getting gunshot residue, given these kind of possibilities of things like contamination, was actually very low. He was convicted of murder. And then after a few years, there was an appeal on the basis of a few things, but also predominantly the gunshot residue evidence. And forensic experts argued that the court had only considered the probability of the gunshot residue if there was contamination, and obviously arguing that that was low. But they also pointed out that actually we should consider the probability of gunshot residue if he actually had shot Jill Dando. And they argued that this was also very low, and they actually did put numbers on it. And they argued that therefore the gunshot residue was actually irrelevant, shouldn't have been admitted. And the judges accepted this argument, and there was a retrial in 2008, and the gunshot residue was ruled inadmissible evidence. And without this evidence, hardly surprising, Barry George was found not guilty. Okay. Just a follow-up, he wasn't actually compensated for the miscarriage because they argued that a juror could reasonably have found him guilty. Okay. So, and we're left with obviously the puzzle: if he didn't do it, who did? Who killed Jill Dando? There's been lots of speculation. No answers at this point. Okay, so that was just a kind of like entry really to get us thinking about the kind of evidence or the kind of inference in a way that I'm going to talk about in this talk. And you know, I'm a psychologist primarily, so I'm really interested in how people reason about evidence. Okay. And the law is only one of the many areas I'm interested in, but it presents really interesting because you have often complex, massive, interrelated hypotheses and evidence, and people need to integrate that and reach singular verdicts. Well, the jury needs to reach a singular verdict, but so it's immensely challenging, and also of strong interest to me is not only how do people do it, but how does this compare with how they should be doing it? Or can we even say what people should be doing? You know, and can we, if people should be doing something different, can we improve their reasoning in some way? But these are all open questions. Okay, so I'm gonna, just as a kind of like a bit of a summary of what I see as a summary of a lot of psychological research, I'm gonna flag this distinction between explaining and evaluating evidence. Okay, and it's a slightly crude distinction, but I think it helps orientate what we know so far about what people do. So on the one hand, explaining it's like reasoning from the evidence. So you use the evidence to come up with a story. Okay, so you use the evidence to construct what you think is the most plausible account of what happened. You kind of generate a story that explains the evidence. Okay, and this is a very dominant part of psychological research. But there's also reasoning about the evidence, and maybe also reasoning about the relations between evidence and hypotheses. And this is something different. It's connected, but it's different. And the idea here is that you need to assess things like the strength and reliability of the evidence. How well does the evidence support different hypotheses? And this often requires integrating complex and potentially conflicting evidence. Okay. And what I would like to argue, and what we've learned, I think, from quite a lot of psychological research, is that people are pretty good at generating stories, even plausible stories, but they may be less capable of evaluating these stories against the evidence. Okay, so they can reason from the evidence and generate a story, but maybe they're not quite as good as reasoning about the quality of the evidence and how well evidence supports their story and other alternative stories. Okay, and this is especially difficult when we have complex bodies of hypotheses and evidence and also high uncertainty. So how should we do it? Well, in the psychological literature, there's a psychologist, very successful, well-known psychologist, Dina Kuhn, who's done lots of great work, and she argues that better reasoning requires coordinating theory and evidence, and we need to. She makes it very clear that we need to distinguish theory from evidence, and also consider multiple hypotheses, consider the strength and reliability of evidence. So she kind of puts forward a series of principles, which I think are all pretty, really sensible, and shows that actually people seem to do better in reasoning tasks the more they kind of, if you like, endorse these principles. Although it's mainly correlational the way she's demonstrated this. And I would argue that these principles are necessary, but maybe not sufficient. So it could be that you do things like gather evidence, consider reliability, but you might still be making reasoning errors. You might still make probabilistic or causal reasoning errors. So it's not enough to have these principles. We need to kind of, in some sense, supplement this with a formal framework that helps us distinguish good from bad inference. Okay, and there might be lots of debates about this, but I feel that we need this in addition to just telling people to look at the evidence, consider the evidence, all that kind of thing. Okay. So, and I'm going to argue that an exciting formal framework we could adopt is looking at causal models. And there's been a lot of work recently by Judea Pearl and others pushing for the use of causal models across the sciences. And but there hasn't been as much applied to legal inference. I mean, some work has been done, but not as much as there could be, I think. So, so from a psychological point of view, it's clear that people do build mental causal models of the world in order to try and make sense of it. That, I think, that's pretty well established. And the idea here is that by attending to formal causal models will help clarify what's normative, what are we doing that might be right or wrong, and also maybe serve as a guide to how we can understand how we actually are trying to build models of the world and where we might be going wrong and how we can potentially correct this. Okay, and so I feel that it gives us a framework, a broader framework for trying to evaluate our capabilities at evidential reasoning. And two things. One is, I think the causal aspect is important, because ultimately we're trying to infer the underlying causes, the underlying causal structure of what generated that evidence. I mean, just thinking of Trudy's, we're not just looking at the bread, we're also interested in how the bread is made. Okay, and I think that's a really nice analogy. And so we need to know how the bread is made, and to me that is trying to understand the causes and the mechanisms behind the generation of the bread. Okay. And also, I think causality is important because it allows us to properly investigate what-if questions and counterfactuals, but I won't talk as much about that in this talk. But we also need it to be probabilistic, to handle uncertainty in a logical and consistent way. So I don't think, as the title of the talk was, are they natural or uneasy bedfellows? I think that in terms of a formal approach, they're natural bedfellows, and I think they should work together, both causal and probabilistic norms together. The reason that they might be uneasy, as you'll see, is that I think people are much more focused on causal reasoning and maybe not so adept at probabilistic reasoning. So that's where the uneasy part of the title comes from. Okay, so I'm not quite sure. This might be a bit horribly basic to many of the audience, but I think it's still good to just, like give you a causal model, and there'll be a few that will emerge in the talk. So let's just give you a nice simple one. And so the idea here is that the nodes represent variables or propositions, and the links between the nodes, in these cases, represent causal relations. We don't always have to have them as causal relations, but I'm going to stick with causal models for this talk. Okay, and here's an example of, we have whether this represents whether or not Barry George shot Jill Dando. This represents my pointer represents the gunshot residue, the presence on his coat. This represents the report that actually there was gunshot residue matching the crime scene. And we also have this representing whether or not the police handled the coat appropriately when they seized it. I mean, apparently when they seized it, there were lots of armed police officers when they seized it, and also when they photographed it, they put it on a police mannequin, which might or might not have had other gunshot residue on it. Okay, and then we have this model. This is a very simple model that it already can support various forms of inference, many of which you're familiar with. So, but let's just step through. So we have a prediction. So we could predict that if Barry George really did shoot Jill Dando, we'd predict that, we could predict that that would increase the probability of the chances of you getting, finding gunshot residue on his coat, and also which would then obviously increase the chances of a positive report about that. And similarly, if the police mishandled the coat, then we would predict that there might be gunshot residue on the coat and also similarly get a report. Okay, so these are kind of, I call them prediction because they're going from a cause to an effect. But also diagnosis, and this is what we're really interested in this case, is if we get a positive report, then that will increase the probability that there is or was gunshot residue on the coat. And that will raise the probability of both of these potential causes, both that he shot her, but also that the police might have mishandled the coat. Okay, and we really ultimately want to try and distinguish, we want to distinguish between these at least. And then just another form of inference that will come up later on in the talk is what's called explaining away. And so here, if we could be sure that there was no handling errors, then the report would actually, increase even more the probability that it was actually Barry George. And in a way, this was a little bit like the arguing in the first court case, where they kind of try to rule out police handling errors, and in that way, thus bolstering the probability that it was Barry George. Okay, so that's a little kind of introduction to causal models, and just I'll be quick on this, but I've been involved with a team of people who have been trying to think about how we can apply these kind of models to investigative reasoning more generally. And we've settled upon an approach where you kind of get what we call idioms, small kind of building blocks, which might reoccur frequently in criminal cases, which capture kind of, if you like, generic inference patterns, and then we can reuse and combine them to compose things to actually make sense of a larger case. And they're based on causal baseness in our case, but it doesn't have to, I don't think it has to be that. But I think I'm going to, argue for how we can learn quite a lot using that formalism as a building block. Okay, and just I'm just going to go through this a bit quickly, but the key idioms. So we have a very basic kind of idiom. It's almost whereby evidence will be an effect of the hypothesis of interest, but like the crime, remember, evidence could be a witness report. And then an important factor which will come up is we want to model the fact that this witness might be unreliable, or the evidence might be unreliable in some way. And we might get evidence about the reliability of the evidence, okay, which we can model and which we can see how people adjust their beliefs according to this kind of, if you like, slightly second order evidence, if you like. And also there's a nice complication where whether or not someone committed a crime might affect the reliability of the witnesses, and I'll come to that a bit later on as well. And an obvious thing here, when we have competing explanations, you might have a crime and then you might have an alternative account which they can compete in different ways. Sometimes an alternative can be exclusive, so the alternative can't exist if a crime happened the way it's claimed. But sometimes you can have an alternative account which is non-exclusive, and we'll come to that very soon. And also, I tend to we try to model things in the causal direction. So therefore, things like motive and character and opportunity are often modeled as precursors, as causes. Again, that's not essential, but I think it really helps clarify the logic of inference. And so I'll be using that. And then also issues of dependence of evidence. I don't talk about that much in this talk, but important way of modeling that. Okay, and just again quickly, so using these kind of models, this is just like demonstration how quickly you can kind of things get complicated. So we have Barry George shot Giordano, and then we can put his location, the fact that he had used guns, he was obsessed with Giordano, he had a certain character, prior convictions. You can put these as, if you like, causes, preconditions, and then we have consequences of a crime event. If it happened, so he ran away, he tried to fabricate an alibi, there was gunshot residue left in his coat, and then you have alternative explanations for all of these, but let's say we can focus on the police handling as an alternative explanation of his of the gunshot residue. Okay, so this is like the story and a few alternative explanations, but then we want to model the evidence, and we add in evidence as effects of these kind of like posited hypotheses. And so here we have the witness testimony about where Barry George was, evidence about his character, witnesses saying they saw him run away, all these kinds of things. And we also have a report about the gunshot residue. All these things are kind of like added in as evidence. And then we can also add in reliability here, representing reliability as another parent of evidence, okay? And we can do that for every bit of evidence. We should consider its reliability, of course. And then we also have evidence about reliability. I've only added one here, but we can do it for everything. And so look, it gets massively complicated, and this is just one small slice of the case. So it gets massively complicated, and solving these kinds of crimes is massively complicated. Okay, right. So hopefully I've motivated the use of some kind of formal modeling might give us some kind of like purchase on some of these cases. Okay, but when we're talking about just lay people trying to reason, maybe as a juror, maybe just as reading a case, we have to, or even an expert, I think this applies to, but I'm focused mainly on lay people because that's who I've done most of my studies on. We have to simplify our models. So we might omit variables, we might omit links, we might make assumptions of exclusivity or exhaustivity of hypotheses, we might assume independence of evidence. We simplify our inference, we might ignore base rates, assume uniform priors, use some kind of mental simulation and sampling rather than doing exact inference. So ultimately, we are boundedly rational, I would argue, and a lot of people argue as well. So we might have to do trade-off the complexity against our limited resources, and this can allow us to do inference in a massively complex context, but it can also lead to biases, and we're kind of familiar with the idea of cognitive biases. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the term cognitive biases, so I actually think most of the time people are amazingly capable at reasoning, but we do go wrong sometimes, but that's just like almost unavoidable given the difficulty of the tasks that face us. Okay, so I'm in the interest, okay, I might not go through all of this. I'll go through a few things, and if you can tell me when I should stop, but I'm going to go through a few things, and I'll try not to dwell too long on these things. Okay, so I'm going to just tell you initially about a set of experiments conducted a few years ago, which was inspired by the Lagnado case, with my colleagues, Toby Pildich and Norman Fenton. So we wondered, actually, we were thinking about the Barry-George case, and we wondered whether maybe there was a possible reasoning error in the Barry-George case. So we modeling the case, you've got the gunshot residue as a effect, and it could have been Barry-George who shot Lagnado, which led to the gunshot residue, or it could have been that the coat was corrupted in some way. And interestingly, in the actual the forensic kind of presentation, they argued that the probability of the gunshot residue, if the coat was corrupted, was low, and they actually put a figure, they 1 in 100. But they also argued, well, if Barry-George shot Lagnado, the probability of getting the gunshot residue was also very low, and they also put that at 100. So they argued that, therefore, the gunshot residue was irrelevant because the probability of getting it is equal on either cause. Okay, and we felt, well, hang on a second, the causes are neither exclusive nor exhaustive here. So it could be that both things happened, that he shot her and the coat was corrupted. And it could be that neither things happened and there was some other reason why the gunshot residue got there. Both could be true or both could be false. And so even though the gunshot residue doesn't discriminate between these two causes, it still raises the probability that George shot Lagnado, because it does, if you like, discriminate between Barry-George shot her versus Barry-George did not shoot her. Okay. So we felt, well, maybe this is a general reasoning error that we could investigate, and it seems so natural to assume that if evidence is equally predicted by two competing hypotheses, then it provides no support for either hypothesis. That feels quite natural, but strictly speaking, I think this only holds if the hypotheses are exclusive and exhaustive, and often they won't be. Okay, and if they're not, then it's possible that the evidence support both hypotheses. Okay. And how widespread might this reason error be? And so at the time, I was doing some work with the US intelligence. So I came up with a kind of terrorist-like example, but we actually have used many other examples. But so this is, often I get audience participation, but it might not be so easy for this one. So here's a test, the nitroglycerine test, which is a real test, actually. And so Anne is suspected of handling explosives. The police use a Grice test for nitroglycerine on the hands, which indicates that they might have been handling explosives. Okay, and so probability of testing positive if you handle explosives is 90%. However, the test can give positive results for other reasons. The probability of testing positive if you handle playing cards shortly before you take the test is also 90%. Okay, so and as it happens, Anne claimed she was playing cards shortly before being tested. So let's say Anne tests positive. Does the positive test give any support to the claim that Anne has handled explosives? So I normally have an audience participation, but I won't today. And initially we just gave people a kind of like qualitative answer. So yes, no, you can't tell. And most people say can't tell. I mean, most people are split, but predominantly say can't tell. Okay, which is maybe right. I would argue it's not actually right. Okay, so, but look, it's the same model. Explosives and playing cards are both possible causes of the positive test. And again, note, the causes are neither exclusive nor exhaustive in this case. And I would argue that under most reasonable assumptions, the answer is yes, it does give positive support. it might not discriminate explosives from playing cards, but the probability of both of those can go up. And but it does discriminate handling explosives versus not handling explosives. Okay, and I think this happens under, I won't go into details, but very reasonable assumptions, which I think pretty much everyone would agree with. Okay, so actually the test does give you some positive support. It might be small, but it gives you some positive support. Okay, so we did a load of experiments on this to see whether lay people endorse this kind of reasoning, and we did, across many different scenarios now. I think that we so we basically did exactly as I've kind of presented it to you, and we've tested probably more than almost 2,000 participants now on this using different scenarios. And just here's just one set of results, really. So we give them exactly the scenario I explained, or across different variations, and these are basically the results of whether they say yes, no, or can't tell for a positive test. And you see, it's no different from chance, really. Only less than 40% of participants are actually giving what we say is the right answer. What's interesting, though, is that if you have a negative test, if the test turns out negative, people are very happy to say that that actually does support there not being explosives. Okay, so it's quite interesting that people are very, very happy to say the test turns out negative and there is support, but they're less happy to say that if it turns out positive, then there is support, which is interesting in itself. Okay, and people were highly confident. We tried to kind of, if you like, correct for this bias, not that successfully, actually. We tried a lot of things. And so we concluded that this, what I call kind of zero-sum thinking, is robust across both qualitative and quantitative judgments. So we've tried it both with numbers and without numbers. And what's interesting, I think, quite fascinating, is that even when you tell people that the causes are neither exhaustive nor exclusive, they still treat them as such, I think, in order to simplify the inferences they make. Okay, so that relates to an earlier finding in psychology. People tend to treat alternative causes as hydraulic, and they tend to kind of like, if they think one is likely, they might degrade the probability of the other. So if one goes up, one goes down. And so therefore, if they get some evidence which kind of speaks positively for both, it's hard to know what to do there. And the idea is that therefore they kind of like don't bolster the probability of either. Okay. So this is, again, I think, a sign of us having to simplify. Even this looks like a pretty simple model, but people have to actually simplify the process of inference and it can lead to errors there. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to a more recent topic that I've been looking at, which is modeling deception. And this is quite early work, so I'm really happy to get feedback and also, to discuss it. And so, and I'm going to just give you an example, the kind of example we've used. We haven't just stuck to legal examples, but this is a kind of example, a legal example. So a man is stabbed. There's been a fight outside a bar, and someone, one youth stabs another. Okay, the police arrest the suspect, and they also get hold of a witness who claims to have seen the stabbing. But it's possible that the witness belongs to the same gang as the suspect. Okay, the police don't know that. It's possible. They know it's possible. They don't know, obviously. Right. And now let's just, a simple kind of like process or assumption here is, if he's in the gang, he will say it's not the suspect, irrespective of what he really saw. Okay. Whereas if he's not in the gang, he'll report what he saw. Okay, this is, so, I mean, we can look into this, but these are kind of like basic assumptions. Okay, and then, so suppose the witness says that it was not the suspect. So maybe you can do this yourselves. How does this change your belief in the suspect's guilt? And how does it change your belief in the witness's credibility? Okay, so this is the kind of question I was really interested in. How do you kind of like update? You might already have some evidence about the suspect, and then you get this witness testimony. How does that kind of change your belief? But also, how does it potentially change your belief in the witness and the credibility of the witness? Okay. And it's a tricky question. I think partly what makes it tricky is that you've got two unknowns here. You've got the probability of, whether this suspect stabbed the victim, but you also got the probability of whether or not the witness is credible. And I've made it a bit more kind of tangible by saying that the witness could have come from the gang or not. So it kind of makes it a bit more quantifiable. And what's tricky here is that the evidence, i.e. the testimony, is generated under two very different worlds. You know, the world where he's an impartial bystander versus the world where he's actually a gang member. And so the assumptions about the strategy or the way that the evidence is generated is crucial here, and what we're assuming about strategy and things like that. And I think that's the really key part about this research at the moment, rather than the results so far are still very early days. Okay, and so we're going to model it again with the same model. Looks very similar, but it has a very important difference. So we have two, if you like, causes of the report. So it's the report is a function both of, you know, what happened, did the person stab them, but also a function of, if you like, the credibility of the witness. Okay, and so I'm just going to focus in on this particular case here. We've got the two causes. And so let's just assume, well, it's true or false that he stabbed the victim, and let's for now just say it's the witness is either credible or not credible. And then the witness report is a function, and for those of you who like probability tables, this is a very deterministic probability table, but we can make it a bit more probable if you like, but we'll stick with the deterministic one because I think it makes the point most clearly. So we've got four states of the world, and then we've got two things that the witness can do. He can say, yes, it was him, or he can say, no, it wasn't him. And what's interesting about this table is that if a witness is credible, he's going to say what he saw, but if he's not credible, he's just going to say, no, he didn't stab him. Okay, so we're assuming here that the not credible equates to him being a gang member. Okay, so really nice, simple model. And then if you, but it kind of slightly surprises me the results it gives. So let's say you have priors of 50-50 on the two hypotheses. Now, this is not essential what your priors are, but let's stick with 50-50. It makes it easier to follow the maths. Okay, 50-50, you get the report. How do you update? Okay, well, that's a question I asked you earlier on. So the probability that victim stabbed, sorry, that X stabbed the victim goes down. Okay, and that I think is fair enough, because you're not sure whether or not the witness is partial or not. But what's really interesting is that your beliefs about the credibility of the witness also should go down. Okay. Now that I found puzzling. It feels counterintuitive. It's like, how can a report simultaneously increase the probability of what the witness says? So you could, you know, raise the probability that it wasn't the suspect, but at the same time reduce your credibility in that witness. Okay, so I found that puzzling. And just to give you, this is one way of understanding that. There's another way, but this is a simpler way, I think. You can think of it, you've got the four possibilities, four possible states of the world before you get the evidence. And then when you get the evidence, when the witness says, no, it wasn't him, we can rule out one possibility here. We can rule out that the witness is credible and X did stab him. So we rule out that one possibility, we're left with three. And again, I mean, we have to think a bit more about probabilistically, but let's say we divide it now across those three. We now have the probability that X did not stab him is now 2/3, but the probability that the witness is credible now goes down to 1/3. Okay, so that's quite an interesting, I think, an interesting, slightly counterintuitive thing. And so I'll be really interested in what people think about this. And this pattern of inference actually doesn't matter what your priors are. And actually it doesn't matter too much about the exact probabilities here. I mean, it has to follow pretty much this format, but it's not kind of strictly tied to this example. Okay, so we did some studies, and these are ongoing work really to see what people's intuitions are here. And people were given crime cases with a backstory about the fight, as I presented it to you. And we asked them what's their prior belief. The witness gives his report, what's your updated belief? And we also added in an expert psychologist who gives evidence about the witness's credibility. Okay, we added that in. This is the model. So we had a yes, no. We looked at both if the witness said yes or no. And we also looked at whether the expert said that the witness was credible or not credible. Okay, and this is interesting because the psychology was added in partly because I did it with a student and they wanted to explore this question, but also I thought it was interesting because it looks at whether some kind of explaining away inference occurs, so that if the expert kind of undermines the witness credibility in some way, whether you then take that to also make the suspect more or less guilty. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the results. Yeah, apologies, it's a bit of a graph, small graph, but hopefully you can see it. So we've got, this is the guilt ratings of a suspect when the psychologist is reliable. I mean, that's not as important, we'll show both, but the key thing here is this is your ratings of whether or not the suspect is guilty, and this is your prior, so people are around 50-50. I mean, we encourage a kind of roughly 50-50 prior. And then when the witness says no, you reduce the probability that they're guilty as predicted, and when the expert says that they are a credible witness, it goes down even further. And similarly, if the witness says yes, then you think that the suspect's more likely to be guilty, and it goes up. Okay, so it makes perfect sense. And it's nice, it's nice to have judgments, see that people are making perfect sense of inferences. And similarly, we find the same effect when the psychologist is unreliable, says the witness is unreliable. Obviously, initially, we have exactly the same pattern, but then when they say he's unreliable, the probability of the guilt of the suspect either goes back down to where it was before, pretty much reverts to where it was before, because you've discounted that evidence. But testimony. Okay, but the more interesting thing is what happens to your judgments about the reliability of the witness. And this goes, as kind of I expected, it goes counter to the model. Okay, so people raise the credibility of the witness. When the witness says, no, it wasn't him, they think he's more credible. Also, when the witness says, yes, it was him, they think he's more credible. And that obviously goes up when the expert testifies that the witness is a credible witness. Okay. And similarly, in the case when the psychologist testifies about unreliability, we have that same initial raising of credibility. Okay. And so this is completely not predicted by our model. We predicted that even though you might think that the guilt of the suspect or whether or not he did it goes down, the model says that you should also think that the reliability of the witness goes down as well. Okay, and so a counterintuitive finding but seems to be incorrect in some way. Okay, and we followed this up with more qualitative experiments. So I'm just summarizing really. People take account of deception, but I think they simplify in a complex inference. And it's very natural to assume that if a witness report about X increases your belief in X, then it should also increase your belief in the credibility of the witness. That's very natural, but our very simplistic model suggests that that doesn't or shouldn't always hold. And I'm very, eager to explore this a bit further. And perhaps that the participants are coming up with a slightly different model than the one we're kind of like saying is the right model here. And I'm, open to, we probably need to enrich the model for sure. And also it's interesting that it shows that the expert evidence changes the belief in credibility, and also hence via a process of explaining away changes the your belief about the event testified. Okay, so I'm just gonna check with you, Anne Ruth. How much time have I got left? I'm probably gonna have to.
We have 20 minutes now, so would it be an idea then we have 20 minutes for discussion?
Okay, what I'm going to do is
sorry?
Shall I just summarize? I'm going to skip my final study and just go to my final couple of slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay. I'm just going to say that you can then extend this model to alibi evidence, which I've done before, and you get what I think is quite intriguing. Maybe what I'll do, Andrew, I'll just do a minute on this and then I'll skip to the back. Is that okay? This is very short. Okay, it's interesting because it ties in with the original story. So in Barry George's case, I had a question of where he was, whether he was at Dando's flat or whether he was at the help center, where he claimed it was. And then so again, it's exactly the same model, but we have to complicate it. And this is why I think it's so interesting that we need to get the kind of, if you like, the data generating model right in order to properly assess inference. Okay. And so his statement depended on both where he was and also his credibility. And we can use a very similar, I won't go into the details, a very similar kind of table here. But if he's credible, he'll report where he was. If he's not credible, he'll report he was not at the flat, irregardless of where he was. Okay. And then we've got this interesting kind of like second path from where he was. I mean, here I'm saying where he was is causally relevant to whether or not he committed a crime, but also, more importantly, whether or not he committed a crime is causally relevant to his credibility. Okay, so you get this kind of like two paths in a way to his alibi. And just the reason I wanted to emphasize this is because it gives you quite an interesting insight, I think, into what you do or what you should do with alibi evidence. So when someone else comes along and discredits this evidence, so when a witness comes along and says, oh, we saw him by the flat, that kind of outright contradicts his claim that he was somewhere else. And this is interesting because this kind of claim is now incriminating him via two routes. It's both telling you that it's more likely they had the opportunity to commit the crime, but it's also telling you that he's more likely to be guilty because he's lying, and his lying is very much, is kind of like a potential consequence of him being guilty. Okay, and we can obviously tinker with this model, and we've looked at this in the main. But the interesting thing here is that even though the alibi by itself reduces guilt, the witness statement by itself increases guilt because it puts him at the crime. But both together increase guilt more than just for witness testimony alone. Okay, so he would be better off not giving the alibi, because now that he's given the alibi, we know that he's lying, and our best explanation for him lying is that he's guilty. Okay, so this is trying to capture the complexity of alibi evidence, just expanding on that model. Okay. Oops. I'm going to completely skip. Oh, I might have to. Okay, look, I'm going to skip this. You can just unconsciously absorb this study, and I'm skipping to. Oh, unfortunately, this study's got loads of slides, but this is just basically looking at the similar kind of ideas, scaling up to a more complex case. So, haven't really missed too much. And we have the paper on this. So let me just skip through to improving. And this is just like a couple of slides, Andrew, so it's okay. So can we, yeah, so
you know that you then will not have time for discussion because now
okay.
half an hour. So
okay, yeah. I'm going to finish, sorry. I'm just going to say that, can we use Bayesnet's tools to help improve inferences when people go wrong, and use people's natural propensity for causal reasoning to with potentially using computational tools? And we've had a bit of success doing this already. And I just wanted to mention, Andrew, that we have a project. This is why I wanted to come to it. But we have a project where we're trying to combine both causal thinking and Bayes in a way, and it's fairly early days, but the idea is that, to try and kind of think how we can combine both of these things to potentially improve inference. Okay, and on that note, I'm going to skip some other stuff. And the verdict so far, people seem to be pretty good at generating plausible explanations, less proficient at evaluating evidence. Perhaps we can use formal tools to help, both for the computation, but also for structuring their inferences. Thank you for everyone who helped participate in this research.